On the 16th of February 1974, in Fort Worth, Texas, after attending a high school dance, 17-year-old Carla Walker was abducted.
The predator came out of the darkness and he said, "You're going with me, aren't you, sweetie?"
It was the last time Carla would be seen alive. When police found her body, they knew they were looking for a callous and merciless killer.
She was beat from head to toe and strangled and raped.
It was horrific. It was simply horrific. I had nightmares.
It would take almost half a century before Carla's depraved attacker was revealed to be church-going family man Glenn McCurley.
He is the kind of person that we tell our daughters about, makes us not go out alone at night. He is the evil predator of our nightmares.
Glenn McCurley had finally been exposed as one of the world's most evil killers. It was a murder that went undetected for nearly 50 years. When 17-year-old schoolgirl Carla Walker was murdered in Fort Worth, Texas in February 1974, nobody knew the identity of her killer until, decades later, cutting-edge DNA testing finally led investigators to 77-year-old Glenn McCurley.
All of a sudden, we had, after 47 years, we had finally solved it.
The brutal killer who'd escaped justice for so long had no place left to hide.
Well, if y'all knew all that, why didn't you come get me back then or something?
Because they didn't know, but we do.
Carla's grieving family would learn that her murderer had been living in their midst all along.
Of course, everybody immediately gets on their computers and does research on this guy. They discover he's a guy who lived blocks from Carla.
Everybody on his street thought he was a great guy, but when he's looking at you, he's not looking at you as a friend. He's looking at you as a real possibility to come see you one night when you're asleep or by yourself.
On the surface, Glenn McCurley was a church-going family man. But beneath the mask, he was a calculating predator. This killer's story begins in 1943. Glenn Samuel McCurley was born on January the 5th in Holmes County, Florida. His childhood was spent in West Texas.
He was the eldest of 3 brothers. When he was a teenager, he was sent away from his family to the Westview Boys' Home in southwest Oklahoma.
In 1961, weeks after McCurley's 18th birthday, he found himself on the wrong side of the law.
He stole a car and led the highway patrol on a high-speed chase, and they finally caught him. Then he was convicted of car theft.
He served 11 months in Huntsville Unit Prison before being granted parole.
Not long after he gets out, in February 1963, he marries a girl called Judy. They had a son and another son a year or two later. At this point, Glenn McCurley is working as a truck driver. They've moved to West Fort Worth in Texas.
The suburban neighborhood suited the couple. It was an ideal place to raise children.
It was very family-oriented, very church-going, very laid back and trusting, and what you would think of as an idyllic childhood. The neighborhoods were full of kids, and we walked everywhere and had pretty much the run of the place. It really was a great place to grow up.
It was definitely thought of as a place where you don't necessarily have to lock your car doors, and your kids are safe to run around the streets and go to parties and, do what they do.
Just over a mile away from the McCurleys was 17-year-old Carla Walker's family home.
Her father was the strict military disciplinarian, but also the protector of the family. They were really, kind of that typical all-American family.
Jim Walker was the family's fifth and youngest child.
I had a mom, Charlene. My dad was Leighton. I had two older brothers, Charles and Steve, and two older sisters, Cindy and Carla. Had a good life. It was a good life. Carla was 5 years older than me, and she was just kind of entering the prime of her life.
At Western Hills High School, Carla was a popular student.
Carla was different. She didn't belong to really a clique sort of thing. She was one of those students who traveled easily among all the different sort of groups. And so that's what made her the all-American kind of girl and very approachable and sort of that girl next door sweetheart.
She's 4'11", 95 pounds, blonde hair, piercing blue eyes, beautiful teeth and lips, just incredibly cute.
She was dating the football player, Rodney McCoy, who was in my class. He was not your typical jock. He wasn't full of bravado. He was also very approachable and personable and got along with all kinds of different kids.
Carla was on the cheer squad. Rodney was a quarterback, and from all accounts, they were kind of the it couple at the high school. And they were a very sweet couple to everybody and to each other.
In the winter of 1974, Carla had just turned 17 and had an exciting date on her calendar.
It was a Saturday. Carla and Rodney were going to a high school Valentine's Day dance on February 16th. The dance went from 8 to 12. Carla got dressed here. The ladies were all fussing over Carla, getting her all fixed up, and Carla was beaming, smiling, had her beautiful dress on.
Carla was wearing a baby blue dress with lots of white ruffles. It was very cute and pretty and went with her strawberry blonde hair. I don't think any of us will ever forget that dress.
Rodney pinned on the corsage, and pictures were taken, and aunts and my mom fussed over Carla. Dad and the guys talked a little bit to Rodney, said, y'all be safe, have fun. See you when you get home. And that's not exactly how it went that night.
But I went to the Valentine's dance that year because I was yearbook editor. And I do remember seeing Carla and Rodney and just, saying hi to them.
It was kind of a typical high school dance, After that, they rode around with some friends, kind of going by the usual haunts, the hangouts.
There were two fast food restaurants right there on farther on Camp Bowie, Highway 183. It was Mr. Quick's Hamburgers in one part, and they shared a parking lot with the Taco Bell. And so that's kind of where the high school students would congregate.
They drove through the parking lot, got out, would talk with everybody. But unfortunately, the bathrooms had been shut down. They weren't working, so Carla needed to use the restroom, and Rodney drove her a block and a half south of Camp Bowie to an all-night bowling alley.
The couple visited the bowling alley twice during the evening. On the second occasion, just after midnight, they decided to remain in the parking lot. It was a decision that would change their lives forever.
They began making out in the car and kind of leaning up against the passenger side door as they were, using her purse as her pillow, I believe, and the door jerks open.
Carla started to fall, and Rodney grabbed her back of her head and started to pull her back in, but when he reached down to grab her, he started seeing stars. He didn't know what was happening.
And he attacks him viciously, and he's very dazed, and the man hits him again.
He was just stunned, had no idea what was going on. Rodney said he saw a hand come in and grab Carla and say to Carla, "You're going with me, aren't you, sweetie?" And Carla was pulled out of the car.
Rodney's suffering head injuries, bleeding all over the place, in his eyes, pretty bad. So Carla tells the man, "I'll go with you, stop hitting him."
Rodney had been beaten with a handgun. When the beating stopped, his attacker spoke directly to him.
He was in the darkness looking in, and all Rodney could see was the pistol coming into his face. And Rodney says, the guy points it right at my forehead and says, "I'm going to kill you." The guy pulled the trigger and it just clicked.
The evening, which had started like a fairy tale, had turned into a horror story, and the nightmare had only just begun. The night 17-year-old Carla Walker was abducted from a parking lot in Fort Worth, Texas. Her family was expecting her and her boyfriend to return home from a school dance.
We waited for Carla and Rodney to come back to hear, about all the fun details of the dance.
In the parking lot of the bowling alley, Rodney regained consciousness. He knew he had to get help.
He hightails it to the Walker home.
I was standing over by the front door and I heard a car, tires hitting a curb head on, going pretty quick. My parents and aunt and uncle did too.
He's pretty frantic, saying they got her. Mr. Walker, they got her.
His right side of his face was lit up and it was all bloody. Big, long cut, like somebody had taken a knife and slit his cheek open a couple inches.
Every mother's nightmare, every parent's nightmare. Their daughter's been abducted at gunpoint by an unknown man.
I stepped back with my back toward the fireplace, watching all the events take place up here. To see these people who were solid people become panicked. When Dad found out what had happened and where it happened, he got his pistol. He was out this door to my left.
At 2:01 a.m., the police were called. A search of the area surrounding the Brunswick Ridgely bowling alley was carried out. Detectives recovered Carla's purse.
I found out about it on the news with Carla's picture. It was just shocking. And from that point on, I was riveted. All of us were, to where she was, what had happened to her.
Carla's abduction launches this gigantic search. And you got high school kids from her school searching. You have virtually every law enforcement officer in the area searching. Helicopters, dogs, all that stuff.
They're searching alleys, behind buildings, construction sites, pastures, rivers, gorges, tunnels.
There was a magazine in the parking lot. Rodney told police the story of being hit on the head with a gun. Obviously, when he tried to shoot Rodney, the magazine had fallen out in the parking lot.
The reason the pistol didn't go off, the perpetrator was hitting Rodney when Rodney fell out with Carla. He ejected his own clip, and there was a bullet in the chamber, but that gun could not be fired without the clip being inserted.
Police had their first real piece of evidence. The attacker had a Ruger .22 pistol, a recent model. What they didn't have was Carla or the name of the person who'd taken her.
It was frightening to know that there was someone out there who could do something like that.
Carla was abducted from a public place. She was abducted in front of a witness as well. Now, that's an incredibly reckless thing for the abductor to do. This is somebody who's particularly dangerous.
There's a panic in this house, spirit of fear. Law enforcement started constantly streaming through that front door for several days.
On the Monday morning, her shell-shocked classmates at Western Hills High School struggled to make sense of what had happened to their friend.
They were devastated. They were like shell-shocked. I don't know how they managed through school that day.
There was a lot of speculation about it being classmates and even Rodney McCoy.
Maybe he's got her captive somewhere, or maybe he drove her out of town, or it was those kinds of speculations.
98% of the time, it's somebody that knows their victim and the victim knows the perpetrator.
The school itself became a focus of inquiry. Detectives spoke to students about the night of the dance in a bid to locate anyone Carla may have interacted with.
I went to the principal's office, and when I got there, there was a police officer and a detective and our principal. They explained to me that because of what had happened to Carla, they would like for me to look at all of the photo negatives from the Valentine's dance that the yearbook photographer had taken. And I didn't see anything.
As the hours turned to days, local, state, and federal forces, as well as family and friends, were all active in the hunt for Carla.
She just disappeared out of the parking lot. I met FBI agents, Texas Rangers, Sheriff's Department, City of Fort Worth, Benbrook, detectives, law enforcement officers. I do remember a palpable tension because I think these seasoned law enforcement officers knew the longer without results, the more likely negative outcome.
A lot of my classmates were part of those search groups that were just going out and walking fields and walking around Benbrook Lake, walking at different places where they thought that they could find something, anything that would have to do with Carla's case.
A team of officers were working a road that's now called Pearl Ranch Road. There was cattle culverts you could hardly see. One of the officers got out of the car while the other officer was waiting, and he went over and leaned over and looked under, and he said, "She's here."
She was found in a culvert, concrete culvert where cattle crossed through under the road, and she's found deceased.
At 6:35 p.m. on the 20th of February, 3 days after she was taken, Carla's body was found 5 miles southwest of the Ridgely bowling alley. The case was now a homicide investigation.
I don't know if you ever heard a guttural scream from a mom who just found her baby dead. It was one of those kind of screams. It's hard to articulate the sound.
That night at the 10 o'clock news, there was actual footage of them taking the body bag out of the culvert near Benbrook Lake. I will never forget that feeling of seeing a body bag and knowing that there was someone I knew inside that body bag.
That same evening, at the All Saints Hospital morgue, Carla's body was autopsied. It revealed multiple injuries, evidence of sexual assault, and strangulation.
They found traces of morphine. Yeah, the medical examiner did say that she had been kept alive and hadn't been dead that long, but she didn't die there in the culvert. She had died before.
During that time, she was probably going through the most horrendous experience, and the person who abducted her was clearly enjoying hurting her, making her frightened, dominating her, or he would have killed her straight away.
I know the parents were freaked out and beginning to keep their kids in at weekend nights.
From that day forward, we locked our car doors. To this day, when I get in the car, the door gets locked.
On February the 22nd, just 2 days after the discovery of her body, Carla's funeral was held at the Western Hills Church of Christ. It was attended by more than 1,200 mourners.
1,000+ people were there. The procession line going from the church, which was law enforcement, had it all wired up and was recording, taking pictures of everybody, thinking that perhaps the suspect would be there.
There's always the possibility that in a crime like this, that maybe the killer will turn up at the funeral or will be standing around on the edges or will be watching, and the police will always want to be mindful of that.
They had us all file by the open casket, and that is probably one of the most traumatizing things I remember from that, especially at that age. The poor girl had been beaten and strangled, and it was simply horrific. I had nightmares.
The funeral yielded nothing on Carla's killer. The best lead investigators had was eyewitness Rodney McCoy.
Carla's boyfriend, Rodney, would be a prime suspect. When a woman dies, the first suspect will always be the intimate partner, the boyfriend.
Rodney McCoy was interviewed, but the problem the authorities had was that because of his head injuries, he couldn't remember very clearly what had happened to him on that fateful night, on the 16th of February, 1974. They sent him to a hypnotherapist to see if they could dislodge his memories.
I want you to tell me what you see. I look up and a gun on my face. First thing I noticed is his short hair, like kind of a skinny nose, some kind of green sleeveless jacket, and cowboy hat. He fell off. What color is the cowboy hat? Oh, it's real light.
He said the guy was dressed like a cowboy. I do remember him saying he had a vest of some sort.
Basing their investigation on the magazine cartridge left at the scene, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms were enlisted to find Fort Worth registered owners of Ruger pistols. With no gun database, it was a mammoth task, taking hundreds of man-hours.
So they began a check of all the Ruger pistols, which that magazine belonged to, in the area.
Authorities come back with around 30 names. The police take their time and interview each one of the 30 people who owned a Ruger 22. One of the people they interview is Glenn McCurley Jr., the truck driver.
As with the other Ruger 22 owners, McCurley was brought in for questioning.
He said that his gun was stolen. He said, I was fishing and I always took this gun for safety, had it wrapped up in a towel under the front seat of my truck, and I could hear a truck spinning off and taking off. And so I went up there to check my truck, and lo and behold, my gun was gone. And he said that happened like before Carla was abducted.
Police didn't have anything else on this guy. They gave him a polygraph test, and from what I understand, he passed.
Very, very little evidence. We're in the days before DNA. There's no CCTV, there's no number plate recognition. It just goes cold.
Despite the efforts of investigators, all leads had been exhausted. For over 4 decades, the stranger who abducted, raped, and murdered Carla Walker remained a free man. Until invisible evidence left behind at the crime scene finally led detectives to the killer's door. In the decades that followed the 1974 rape and murder of 17-year-old Carla Walker, her family in Fort Worth refused to give up hope.
Cindy, her sister, and Carla's mom spent a lot of their time, a lot of their lives keeping Carla's story alive.
I saw my mom from 74 until really 79, what I know now to be go through chronic clinical depression. She still got up, she still washed clothes, made dinner, tried to have happy Christmases, happy events, but she had changed. My dad was, to me, my hero because he carried my mom.
The mystery of Carla Walker's unsolved murder was one which never went away.
These cases never get absolutely shut down. They never say case closed where they haven't arrested anybody. So it becomes what we refer to as a cold case.
1974, 1978, 1985, every time a new lead came in, they jumped on it and they investigated it thoroughly. It was one of those cases that detectives worked their whole careers on. And so as the cases would go through and technology would change, it would come back up.
Things kind of quieted down, and then things would pop up if there was a suspect, but then they would say that he had been cleared or whatever.
You would have conversations semi-regularly about, hey, there's this new technology, should we try it? Hey, we are thinking about sending this off for testing, what do you think?
In 2016, Carla's story caught the attention of podcaster Vincent Strange. It would catapult the case back into the spotlight.
I came upon Carla's story, just kind of internet search, and it grabbed me right away. There was one Facebook page. It was Justice for Carla, and there was just no activity on it. There was nothing happening. We need to get this out before the public, shine a light back on it.
When Vincent called me out of the blue at my job one day and he introduced himself and he said, I was told that you were the high school yearbook editor and that you knew a lot of people and that you might be able to help me get it started.
Carla's friends and family took part in the podcast. The renewed interest in her murder motivated her brother to give it one more shot with the police.
Jim, who was only 12 when the killing took place, never forgot and kept in touch with the detectives throughout the ensuing years, badgering them to look into what might have happened, keeping on at them.
Fort Worth PD had reopened the case at Jim Walker's urging. He literally called up the cold case department and said, all right, I hear there's a new detective and I need y'all to start looking at it again.
Leah Wagner, cold case detective, received a call from Jim that was stern and pretty to the point.
You've worked hard. Problem is, whoever killed my sister is either dead, dying, or getting extremely old right now. I think we need a new set of eyes on Carla's case because we're running out of daylight. And I would like to find this person, why he's got a pulse.
The paperwork on the case was extensive, over 6,000 pages of information.
There were 2 banker boxes filled with handwritten notes of leads and investigation tips and investigations the police had begun on their own. They truly left no stone unturned.
They were re-interviewing everyone. I know a lot of that focus was on Rodney still.
I went to interview, you know. One time, I think they picked me up at one of my baseball games.
Every time a new investigator would pick up the case and they would write out their who I want to talk to list, Rodney was always number 1 on the list. I think the ultimate list maybe had 38 people on it of let's re-interview these people.
The team were hopeful that DNA testing could help the investigation. The science did not exist in 1974, but perhaps now could help name the rapist and murderer.
And so we went to go pull the evidence to see what we had. And when I tell you, it is like an angel spoke to the crime scene officers in 1974. They did everything right. They preserved it in ways they didn't even know were going to be so important.
DNA tests are expensive, there's no question of that. And to carry out the DNA test that was necessary on Carla's clothing would have cost $20,000.
Vincent Strange's podcast about Carla's murder had gained a lot of exposure. One listener, a TV presenter, offered to put up the money to fund the DNA testing. In 2019, an unexpected call came in to the police department.
They got a call from NBC Universal saying, we want to do a case in your cold case division. The detectives were literally working on Carla Walker's case at the time. And so they paid for some testing. Whatever our DNA was going to come from, it was going to come from Carla's clothes. There was so much of Rodney's blood on her dress from his head injury. Finding DNA on the dress that was not Carla's and was not Rodney's was hard to do. There was definitely a male sample that didn't belong to Rodney, that was semen, was on Carla's bra strap. And so in 2020, they say, here we go. And we waited. We get the call that says there were no matches. And it was so disheartening.
Not one single hit is found. Not one. Well, we're back at square one, except we aren't. Another DNA test is conducted. by a different company.
We had so little DNA left to test. We had 4 nanograms, which is nothing. It's nothing. And we knew this was it. We had 1 shot to test it.
They were able to take these, like maybe 2 cells. Starting in June of 2020, they started working Carla's case.
When you get forensic genetic genealogy results, they don't tell you who a person is. You're going to have a list of someone who is in the database for having given their DNA to a commercial database. And what you get is, hey, we know this person here is a 2nd degree, a 3rd degrees away relative.
On Independence Day weekend of 2020, the DNA tests finally revealed a familial match.
We've got a family named McCurley we think you should look into. There were 3 boys. They lived kind of in the Denton area. And before he can even finish talking, Detective Bennett, who knew the file backwards and forwards, which is an impossibility given the size of the file, but he did, he hops up and says, I know Glenn McCurley. He's on our list.
And I think he had 84 suspects on that list. I think McCurley was 18th on that list.
The DNA analysis linked semen found on Carla's bra strap to the McCurley family. Next, they set out to demonstrate that it belonged to the man they interviewed in 1974 about the Ruger 22 pistol. The now 77-year-old Glenn McCurley.
We did what's called a trash run, which means you wait until someone puts their trash out on the street, because then it is no longer private property. And in the middle of the night, the police come and take a trash bag and they take it back to the lab, and you try to find things in the trash that you know are going to have DNA on it. In this particular case, it was a McDonald's straw.
Law enforcement did all their due diligence, redoing a DNA profile to make sure the profile that came out of the trash grab was the same profile discovered on the inside of Carla's bra strap, which was a semen.
To make sure the DNA evidence would be admissible in court, detectives needed to obtain an official DNA sample from Glenn McCurley. Police went to his home to speak to him again.
In order for us to eliminate you, the quickest way to do that is to get your DNA. Is that something that you would be okay with?
Glenn McCurley is an upright member of the community. He and his wife Judy are churchgoers. They're well known in that suburb of Fort Worth. He hesitates for a moment and then agrees to have his cheek swabbed for DNA.
And all it is 2 big cotton swabs. I promise they won't go up your nose. They're going to be the inside of your cheek.
We had a search warrant ready to go, but he ultimately consensually gave his DNA. We sent that back off to the lab, and they said, this matches the straw, which matches the bra, which matches the crime. And so all of a sudden, we had, after 47 years, we had finally solved it.
Glenn Samuel McCurley. It was the guy who killed my sister.
At a press conference in Fort Worth, it was announced, his name was announced. It was a shock to everyone because this was a guy who lived blocks from Carla.
He had sons that went to Western Hills. His wife, Judy, worked in the nursery at one of the churches that a lot of people went to. His family was known in the area.
Since 1974 until the day he was arrested, he drove up and down Williams Road almost every day. Drove by the house. He knew exactly where we lived. I'm pretty sure he came by here when we had garage sales.
He is a man who is able to commit this heinous crime and live amongst us like he's a normal person. There's nothing more terrifying than that.
After so many years of torment, Carla Walker's loved ones were within touching distance of the truth about her brutal rape and murder in February 1974. But Glenn McCurley wasn't going down without a fight. And at his upcoming trial, he was going to plead not guilty. On September the 21st, 2020, the man who detectives had linked with the murder of 17-year-old Carla Walker was arrested. Glenn McCurley was taken to the police station to be interviewed about that fateful night of February the 16th, 1974.
They went to his home and they arrested him, and they took him to the police station and they interviewed him.
I don't know the girl. I've never seen her. And I haven't killed anybody.
For the first hour, he starts saying he doesn't even know who Carla Walker is.
Well, I don't see how you could have anything on me because I don't know anything about it.
During the 3-hour interview, police worked to get a confession from McCurley.
How are you going to make things right before you pass away if you don't admit to the things that you've done?
No matter how many times I watch that video,
this is just your opportunity to tell your side of what happened.
every time I hold my breath. Where he pauses and he gets real quiet and he puts his head down.
I did do it, I guess.
That's basically his confession there. They got him.
He says, I strangled that little girl. Justice was going to be served that day. It was a pretty magical moment.
McCurley said that he was saving Carla, that Rodney was assaulting her, and he kind of comes in and saves the day. She went with him willingly, and they started having consensual relations.
She started hugging me, thanking me.
We know that's not what happened, but it does definitely put him there with her, which was the important part.
After 46 years, McCurley had admitted to being responsible for the death of Carla Walker. And he had another confession about the gun he'd claimed was stolen.
He also tells them where he's hidden the gun, a Ruger 22. He's wrapped in a towel and put it in the attic of his house. You might ask yourself, why on earth did he keep the gun? Was it a souvenir, a trophy?
No one thought he kept the gun. We didn't even think to ask it, because why would you?
He could relive what he did to Carla through that gun, but they do like to relive their crimes, visit back those feelings that they felt when they were committing those crimes. And that gun was a link for him.
So the police leave the interview and go back to his house and look, and sure enough, there's the gun. In 2020, court systems were taking a little bit of a break due to COVID. Due to McCurley's age, we knew we needed to try it sooner rather than later.
When we started going through pretrial hearings in May of 2021, and I knew justice was going to be served, I knew I personally would be able to make sure he would never, ever breathe the air of a free man.
We knew, obviously, the biggest portion of this case that was going to be contested would be the new science, the forensic genetic genealogy. It actually had never been admitted in the United States at that point.
In Tarrant County Criminal District Court Number 1, Carla's friends and family had their first glimpse of the man accused of her murder almost half a century ago.
He was actually kind of an imposing figure. He was very tall. He definitely had kind of a gruff exterior the whole time. He also was in a wheelchair, even though I had seen him walk in and out of the courtroom on days when the cameras weren't there.
He just looked like a confused, angry old man. He had cancer. He wasn't expected to live long. I certainly had no sympathy for him.
Inside the courtroom, Carla's friends and family sat on one side. On the other, those who'd come to support the defendant, Glenn McCurley.
Watching his son was pretty brutal. His son was just devastated. It was unbelievable, the pain in his eyes and his face. McCurley's wife, on the other hand, they were blowing each other kisses and stuff like that during the trial. It was a bit strange.
In the courthouse, under the glare of the national media, the prosecution worked hard to tell the story of what had happened to Carla.
On the night that Carla was abducted, McCurley's wife was away, so he had complete freedom, really, to come and go from the house.
His wife happened to be out of town. He went out drinking, and he certainly knew what he was looking for, I think. He didn't just stumble across Carla on accident. He was lying in wait for somebody.
How did he manage to confront his wife at church every Sunday morning, knowing that he'd quite premeditatedly taken this young girl's life? Without a moment's hesitation, and what's more, tortured her, dumped her, raped her. How do you do that?
I saw the trial every day, even though I wasn't there in person. And when Leah Wagner, the detective, pulled Carla's dress out of that evidence bag, it took my breath away. To see that dress again just put me right back to 1974.
This wasn't a minimal crime by any stretch of the imagination. She was beat from head to toe and strangled and raped.
At the start of the third day of Carla Walker's murder trial, Glenn McCurley, who for so long had denied his role in Carla's murder, spoke to his attorney.
The medical examiner and Carla's brother Jim were going to testify. They were about to go through that in excruciating detail, and I think he just didn't want to sit through it and didn't want his family to hear it, and so he asked to plead guilty. The judge has him sit down and says, "Are you pleading guilty?" And all of a sudden, the room got silent.
That was pretty amazing. I don't think any of us expected that.
I remember turning around and looking at the Walker family and just thinking, I can't believe I get to be here for this moment.
On the morning of Tuesday, August the 21st, 2021, almost half a century since Carla's murder, 78-year-old Glenn McCurley pleaded guilty to capital murder and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Jim Walker, it provided the opportunity that he'd waited nearly 50 years for. To look the man who killed his sister in the eye.
Because I believe in God, I'm a Christian. So I told him, I said, I want you to know I forgive you and I hope and pray to see you in heaven.
Never in my career have I ever seen anything like that. Never, probably will again. So then I see Jim begin to hug McCurley's son.
I told his son, you don't own the sins of your dad. It's not on you. You've been victimized as well.
He was 12 when his sister died, and he had the grace to walk over and hug that man's family and show them love.
I was so happy for our community, for Carla's friends. I was so happy for Rodney because he'd been under a cloud of suspicion for decades. I can't describe the peace other than I know where it came from. I had peace, and I still have peace.
9 months after his conviction, in one final desperate act, Glenn McCurley appealed his conviction, but the killer was unsuccessful.
I pushed for the death penalty, but because of his age, we figured he was going to die in prison anyway.
The appeal process was finalized in May of 2023, and McCurley died in prison that summer.
On the 14th of July 2023, 80-year-old Glenn McCurley died in the Gib Lewis unit, Texas, taking his secrets to the grave.
He never said why. He never really said how. The police who found her body said that she wasn't killed there. She was killed somewhere else and dumped there. There's still a lot of questions that we would have liked answered.
For the family, justice for Carla, but also a legacy offering hope for other families that forensic genetic genealogy be available to help solve their cases.
The Carla Walker Act will provide forensic genetic genealogy funds to focus in on code cases and get those code cases work hopefully resolved. Never give up. You're the voice for your loved one. We don't know why we go through these things, but remember, goodness is always there. There's good people there who want to walk through this difficult time with you, but don't give up. Have hope.
He abducted, raped, and killed a young girl in the prime of her life. He spent a lifetime watching the carnage he'd caused and the ruined lives of those left behind. Because of this, Glenn Samuel McCurley's name will be remembered as one of the world's most evil killers. In a deserted, swampy patch of woodland in New Britain, Connecticut in 2007, the scattered remains of several women were discovered.
I have never had a case where I had 7 possible victims at one crime scene.
For 10 long years, detectives worked to discover who the victims were and who'd killed them.
After the bones were found, I think it was clear that there was a serial killer.
The investigation zoned in on a battered blue van belonging to local gardener William Devin Howell.
And they just started to pick that van apart, fiber by fiber, droplet by droplet.
It is a positive gold mine, a treasure trove of DNA, of all manner of clues.
When the true nature of Howell's crimes were revealed, they were breathtaking in their brutality.
Physical violence, strangulation, probably some of the most violent behavior that I've ever handled as a lawyer.
14 years after the first innocent victim was snatched from the street, William Devin Howell was finally confirmed as one of the world's most evil killers. In 2017, a case that had gripped and horrified a quiet corner of New England concluded with one of Connecticut's most prolific serial killers, 47-year-old William Devin Howell, being locked away for life. But when the story began 14 years earlier, it had gone largely unnoticed.
The media hadn't really covered it very much. No one had really put together that we had all these missing women.
If she was a drug taker with addictions, if she was a sex worker, it's not unusual for them to go missing and not be reported for quite a long time.
When stories of the missing women's fate were finally told, it exposed a dark underbelly that many in this leafy part of Connecticut did not know existed.
Central Connecticut was more of a manufacturing area back in the 30s, 40s, 50s. And over time, drugs has infiltrated those areas. And with drugs is prostitution.
But above all, the story showed the world that truly monstrous people are sometimes able to hide in plain sight.
Bill Howell is one of those individuals that was convicted of committing horrific acts of violence. And yet, he's a likable man that you think about and you say, how could he have done this?
This killer's story begins on the 11th of February, 1970.
He grew up in Newport News, Virginia, which is a population of about 200,000 people.
His mother was 40 and his father was 45 when Howell came along.
William Devin Howell, known as Bill, was the youngest of 4 children. Despite a stable childhood, in his late teens, Howell began to take the wrong path.
He went to school, he dropped out of school.
Towards the end of his adolescence, Bill Howell drifted into drugs, and he then got drawn into petty crime.
He had some motor vehicle violations that ultimately caused his license to be suspended, and it became a vicious cycle. He continued driving, kept getting arrested, and it resulted in jail time.
By his mid-20s, Howell had collected convictions for drink driving, forgery, reckless driving, and public drunkenness. In 2001, aged 31 years old, he left Virginia.
He met a woman, and she was from Connecticut, and he ended up coming to Connecticut.
Moving in with his girlfriend Dorothy in New Britain, William Howell took on a veneer of respectability.
Howell appeared to be quite settled. He had a relationship, a girlfriend. He had a job.
He had this landscaping business that he seemed to be doing okay with.
He cut people's lawns. It was not the kind of lawn mowing service that you see landscapers in affluent communities, just a small 22-inch lawnmower. And it was in the more urban areas of older people that stayed in those communities, and they hired him. And they said he was very nice, reliable. He'd come on a weekly basis.
He had a dark blue 1985 Ford Econoline van. It was pretty smashed up. It had plywood over some of the windows. He had on the side quality lawn work, call Devin, and his cell phone.
But criminality was never far away. In 2002, Howell picked up more convictions for minor offenses. By this time, he was a frequent visitor to the Berlin Turnpike area, a 10-minute drive from the home he shared with Dorothy.
The Berlin Turnpike has many, many commercial establishments, restaurants, hotels, motels, different shopping centers.
Well, the Berlin Turnpike was one of the main roads that used to go between New York and Boston, so there were a lot of little hotels, and over time, those hotels stopped being used by conventional travelers and ended up being used by hookers and johns and more nefarious type of activity.
William Devin Howell was drawn to the area where drugs and prostitution went hand in hand.
Many people who are females who are drug addicts, they end up prostituting themselves in order to get the money. And Mr. Howell was able to get some drugs and party with these women.
In April 2003, a young woman was reported missing from a town some 25 miles from the Berlin Turnpike.
Melanie Ruth Camellini, she was from Seymour, Connecticut. She went missing from the city of Waterbury. She was the mother of 2, dearly loved by her family.
When 29-year-old Melanie's mother reported her missing to Waterbury police, she hadn't seen her daughter for several months.
Waterbury PD was taking point on it in the missing person report. Terrific investigators.
Despite an investigation, there were no leads into Melanie's disappearance. A month later, there was another missing persons report in the same town.
Marilyn Gonzalez was 26. She too was a mother of 2.
Last seen on the 15th of May 2003, Marilyn was reported missing by her mother a few days later.
Her loved ones were just frantically trying, what happened to her?
On the 24th of June, another desperate mother went to the police, this time in New Britain.
Janice Roberts is a transgender woman. She was in her 40s at the time. Her family thought that she went to New York City and possibly ran into some trouble down there. They just didn't know.
No one knew if the missing women had chosen to leave the area or if something more sinister had befallen them.
Even when all of these women were reported missing, they weren't linked by the police. Things are made more complicated when people go missing from different police jurisdictions because they don't necessarily always share that information. They won't be looking at the missing person lists from neighboring jurisdictions.
By the summer of 2003, 3 women were missing from towns in the Berlin Turnpike area. There was no uproar, no panic. Women weren't safe on the streets, but they had no idea. In July 2003, 33-year-old William Devin Howell was living with his girlfriend in New Britain, Connecticut. On the 31st of July, the mother and sister of 33-year-old Nilsa Arizmendi walked into Wethersfield Police Department 9 miles away and reported that they hadn't seen Nilsa for almost a week.
Nilsa Arizmendi had an on and off relationship with her childhood sweetheart, who was always known as Ace, and they were living in a motel in New Britain.
She was a drug user, might have engaged in some prostitution also.
She had quite a stable life, actually, so her disappearance was flagged up as this is out of the ordinary for Nilsa.
Nilsa's boyfriend, Ace, a convicted drug dealer, was first on the list of people to question. Insisting he had no idea what had happened to Nilsa, Ace passed a polygraph test. Worried sick about his girlfriend's disappearance, Ace was desperate to help.
He gave the police all the information he had.
Ace told detectives about the last time he'd seen Nilsa. It was late at night, after the couple had been hanging out with a man they knew only as Devin.
Nilsa, her boyfriend, and this guy were doing drugs in a parking lot at a supermarket in Wethersfield. After that, her boyfriend saw her get into this weird-looking van that was partly blue, partly black, and had wood boards where the side windows should have been.
It was the first solid lead into working out what had happened to Nilsa.
The blue van became a target of the Wethersfield Police Department's investigation.
The name Devin and the description of a van were all police had to go on in the search for Nilsa. But 2 months later, a sharp-eyed patrol officer spotted the vehicle in Wethersfield.
So they traced the van. The van is traced back. The owner is Dorothy Holcomb.
And that's when they went to Miss Holcomb's residence trying to interview her.
Police records showed a man had been living at Dorothy's address. One with an outstanding warrant for an assault on his girlfriend. His name was William Devin Howell.
When the police arrived to talk to Dorothy, she said, "Oh, well, Bill has the van most of the time. It's just registered my name."
He tried to dodge the interviews, and she kind of protected him from the police. You know, they'd come in the front door, he'd go out the back door type of thing.
Detectives were desperate to interview the man last seen with Nilsa, but he kept evading them. Meanwhile, they turned their focus on the van Nilsa had climbed into the night she disappeared.
They got a search warrant for the vehicle.
But when they returned in November to seize the battered blue van, neither Howell nor the vehicle were anywhere to be seen. In January 2004, Wethersfield police finally caught up with William Devin Howell. The gardener denied any involvement in Nilsa Arismendi's disappearance, and his van, which they hoped might hold some clues, was still nowhere to be found.
Part of the problem was they didn't have her body. They didn't know what happened to her. She could have taken off. No one knew that she was dead at that point.
With no van, no evidence, and nothing to tie him to Nilsa beyond the word of her boyfriend, detectives had no choice but to let Howell go. Weeks later, another young woman was reported missing by her family.
Joy Verleen, also known as Joy Martinez. She's 24. Joy Verleen was a popular girl at school. She was a track star.
Born into a large and loving family, somewhere between her late teens and early 20s, Joy Verleen had fallen into drugs. She'd last been seen in October 2003.
She doesn't appear for her birthday, which her mother finds quite strange, and then she doesn't appear at Thanksgiving.
On the 29th of March 2004, Joy's mother reported her missing to police in East Hartford. 2 days later, in Wethersfield, the team who were searching for Nilsa Arismendi finally had some luck, 600 miles away from Connecticut.
They found the vehicle in North Carolina, the blue van. They then got a search warrant, and then they had the van towed back.
The van had been hidden on a property belonging to one of Howell's associates. 8 months after Nilsa Arismendi vanished, would it hold any clues about what had happened to her?
The crime scene investigators are let loose on the Ford Econoline van.
They noticed that the back seat, the cushions had been replaced, and they ended up pulling those cushions back, and then they found what they believed was blood, and then reddish-brown stains on the carpeting.
This disturbing find suggested that someone had lost a large amount of blood in the back of the battered work van. The question was, who?
The police department submitted a piece of the car seat back and a piece of the carpet from the van to the laboratory.
Forensic science examiner Kristen Maydell was part of the team at the State Forensic Lab, tasked with analyzing the stains on the upholstery. The first set of tests confirmed the stains were, in fact, human blood. The next step was to find out who the blood had belonged to. When the results came back, there was a shock.
From the initial testing of those two samples, they were two different DNA profiles.
It appeared that at least 2 people had come to harm in Howell's van. As is common in missing persons cases in the US, Nilsa Arismendi's mother had given the police a DNA sample when her daughter disappeared.
DNA gets passed from parent to child, where you get half your nuclear DNA from your mother and half your nuclear DNA from your father.
If human remains were found, the authorities would be able to say if the victim was likely to be a close relative of Nilsa's mother. Sadly for Nilsa's family, there was a match.
The mother of the missing person did match the DNA profile from the van.
It was an important breakthrough for the case, but a body blow for Nilsa's anxiously waiting family.
The medical examiner said she couldn't have survived that much blood loss.
It seems certain that Nilsa Arismendi was dead. Police had no idea who the second DNA profile belonged to, with more questions than answers about what had happened in Howell's van. Investigators needed to tread carefully.
It takes a long time for the prosecutors to be absolutely sure that they can charge Howell with Nilsa's killing. Blood in the van, opportunity, the fact that Ace had seen her getting into the van. But the difficulty is there's no body.
On the 14th of May 2005, William Devin Howell was arrested in connection with Nilsa Arismendi's death. 3 days later, he was charged with her murder. But the police knew getting a conviction would be tough.
The problem was they didn't know what happened to her. They knew something bad happened in the van, but there was no weapon, there was no trace of the body.
Howell was remanded in custody until his trial. For now, a suspected killer was off the streets. But would it be for good? Almost 4 years after Nilsa Arismendi's disappearance, 36-year-old William Devin Howell stood in the dock at New Britain Superior Court in Connecticut.
On the 24th of January 2007, William Devin Howell stands trial for the murder of Nilsa Arismendi. The DNA evidence is produced. Witnesses, including Ace, are produced.
Howell's defense was that it was her boyfriend Ace who'd attacked Nilsa, arguing the couple had fought in the back of the van. The prosecution highlighted the amount of blood spilled in the van and the fact that Nilsa hadn't been seen since that night. On the 5th day of the trial, Howell changed his plea.
He did a plea bargain and he used something called the Alford plea.
What the Alford Doctrine stands for is you'd say, I understand if I go to trial, there's a significant chance I'll be convicted and face harsher punishment. So in order to avoid that, I'm going to plead guilty, even though I'm not admitting my guilt.
On the 30th of January, Howell pleaded guilty to first-degree manslaughter. Still refusing to give any information about what had happened to Nilsa Arismendi or where her remains could be found, Howell was jailed for 15 years. Just months later, on the 20th of August 2007, local police got a phone call that had the potential to shed light on Nilsa's fate.
The New Britain Police Department got a call from a resident who was walking through some woods off of Hartford Road in New Britain, and he said he found what he thought were human remains. I was a lieutenant in the Bureau at that point. So we responded, we canvassed the scene.
That area is very commercial. It was like a little strip mall, and in the back is a little parking area. And right below that is a steep drop-off, and then there's a wooded area.
It's really not a place you would easily walk through because of the briar, some of the wildlife that's there, or completely swampy. It goes underwater quite a bit. It's not where someone would want to walk and go have a picnic.
More officers were brought in to search the densely wooded area.
We found a few more remains that evening and into the next day. And That's when we discovered it wasn't the remains of one person, but it was the remains of 2 females.
Confirming that they had found the partial remains of 2 adult women, the state medical examiner gave an estimate as to how long the scattered bones had laid there.
He gave us a very wide range, with the caveat is depends on weather, depends on animal activity. So we knew they weren't hundreds of years old. We knew that they weren't a year old.
A couple of days later, a third partial skeleton was recovered. There was nothing with the bodies to identify them, but one conclusion seemed inevitable. The women had all likely been murdered, and almost certainly by the same assailant.
We certainly were working on the strong possibility that we had a serial killer.
With William Devin Howell's conviction fresh in the minds of local law enforcement, the question on everyone's lips was, could any of the bodies be Nilsa Arismendi's? The state forensic lab was brought in once again.
They submitted a sample from the 3 different possible bodies for us to do DNA testing on.
DNA profiles were developed from the bones, but when they were run through the DNA database, there was more disappointment for Nilsa's family.
We did try to make a connection with Nilsa, but there were no matches there.
In fact, there were no matches in the system for any of the women. Without knowing who they were, investigating the women's deaths would prove difficult.
If you don't know who the person is that has been killed, it's near on impossible to identify your suspects. There's always a motive for every murder. You're never going to find out what that motive is unless you identify the body.
New Britain police threw themselves into working out who the women were.
Looking at unsolved missing persons reports and just try to chase them all down. The FBI down in Quantico offered their services to create an approximation of 2 of our victims. We put it in the newspapers, gave it to the media.
It was a slow and frustrating process. And as James Wardwell and his team worked to identify the victims, they couldn't shake the suspicion there might be more bodies lying in the woods.
Never stopped believing there was more in there. Still believed in our heart of hearts Nilsa was in there. Still believing that there might be more victims.
Were police on the right track? Was William Devin Howell in fact a serial killer? With Nilsa just one of his victims?
We certainly were keeping all options open because we don't know yet, but that was definitely a working theory, that there was a connection, and Nilsa was also connected to our site.
In December 2010, New Britain PD got their first breakthrough when a woman called introducing herself as the sister-in-law of New Britain resident Diane Cusack. She'd seen the photo in the papers of the facial reconstruction of one of the unidentified women.
She said, "Oh, the face sure looks like Diane. The hair's wrong, but the face looked right."
Diane Cusack lived alone in New Britain. I don't think she really was in contact with her family. She wasn't reported missing right away.
So we were ultimately able to make that connection through dental records and DNA and made our first positive ID. I remember sitting down at their kitchen table and sharing that news with them. I know it brought them pain, but I could see it also brought them some relief. I remember it like yesterday, that part, because it's nobody deserves what happened to her.
The tragedy for Diane Cusack and her family was nonetheless an important step forward in the investigation.
Really started opening everything, because then we could start retracing her steps, placing her in places.
53-year-old Diane hadn't been seen since July 2003. She'd lived in the same neighborhood as William Devin Howell, and the police believed they may have crossed paths. But there was no proof or evidence to link Diane to Howell. The investigation went cold until 2013.
Connecticut State's Attorney's Office has a cold case unit, and they put a task force together.
DNA from the remains in the woods was resubmitted to the State Forensics Lab. And in September 2013, there was another positive ID.
Joy Valine Martinez, she was actually the first remains that were found that first day in 2007.
The breakthrough also provided crucial evidence that William Howell had killed more than once. The second person's blood found along with Nilsa's in the back of Howell's van was proven to be 23-year-old Joy Valine's. The case was building, but detectives suspected there was much they still did not know. In 2014, they tried something new.
One of the things that the State's Attorney's Cold Case Squad did was make playing cards of unsolved homicides that they distributed in all of the prisons.
They're free for the inmates to use, and just ask if anyone has information, please call to spark conversations.
One inmate couldn't believe the hand he'd been dealt. William Devin Howell, who was a decade into his sentence for the manslaughter of Nilsa Arismendi, was about to blow the investigation wide open. At Connecticut's Cheshire Correctional Institution in 2015, 45-year-old William Devin Howell opened up to his cellmate, Jonathan Mills, revealing what had really happened to Nilsa Arismendi 12 years earlier. Around 3 a.m. that night in July 2003, Nilsa and her boyfriend, who sometimes took drugs with Howell, met him in a supermarket car park.
He sees Nilsa climb into Bill Howell's dark blue Ford Econoline van and drive off.
Shortly after Nilsa entered Howell's van, he attacked her, punching her in the face, causing her nose to bleed heavily. He then grabbed her round the throat.
She is strangled and she is dumped behind the shopping mall.
But Nilsa had not been his first victim.
He tells Mills that I didn't just kill Nilsa, I killed 6 other people as well.
Howell told Mills his first victim early in 2003 had been Melanie Ruth Camillini. Howell had raped and strangled her in the back of his van.
It was too cold to bury her body, and so he literally drove around with her body in the van for several weeks.
He used to sleep next to her, calling her his baby.
And he cut off her fingertips and tore off the bottom of her jaw to take her bottom teeth out and put them in a garbage bag and threw them in a dumpster. He told Mills that once he had killed the first woman, that was like crossing the Rubicon, and It became easier after that, and he perfected his method, is I think how he put it.
Over the next 10 months, William Devin Howell had targeted women on the fringes of society.
Most of all these focused around drugs, whether Howell was providing them or they were getting in his van because they were going to do drugs with him.
Once in the back of the vehicle that Howell called his murder-mobile, the women were brutally attacked.
There was a lot of violence, physical violence, strangulation, hitting them with objects, a hammer, for instance.
He controlled these women. He was a big guy.
With his second victim, 26-year-old Marilyn Gonzalez, restrained through the night in the back of his van, Howell drove around the local area.
He actually went through a drive-thru to buy her last meal. She ate the meal and he raped her and killed her.
Referring to himself as a sick ripper in his disturbing confession to his cellmate, Howell also shed light on the fate of a woman who'd been reported missing in June 2003.
Howell's third victim, who he picked up on the 18th of June 2003, was Janice Roberts. But actually, she was transgender.
While a sexual act was being performed, Mr. Howell realized it was a trans person doing it, which caused him to become very angry.
Howell strangled 44-year-old Janice to death. After the orgy of violence, Howell would dispose of his victims' bodies.
Howell told them about what he called his garden. And Mills realized what he was talking about was where he buried victims.
The victims were just discarded like objects and not as people, like yesterday's rubbish. Just awful.
Howell told Mills that after Melanie, Marilyn, and Janice, he'd murdered Diane Cusack. The next victim was Nilsa Arizmendi, followed by Joyvelin Martinez. Then Howell confessed to a final victim from October 2003, a 40-year-old woman from Waterbury who'd never been reported missing.
Mary Jane Maynard went out to buy cigarettes, and I suspect she just encountered Howell, who was often driving around the area, possibly looking for victims. Mary Jane's daughter was serving overseas at the time, so nobody noticed that Mary Jane had gone missing.
Mary's partial remains were amongst those found in 2007 and had finally been identified in September 2014.
One of the tragedies of Mary Jane Maynard is that although she'd had a substance abuse problem, she turned her life around and she'd in fact become a counsellor, making her death all the more tragic and all the more cruel.
Having heard William Howell's horrifying story, Jonathan Mills hoped it might gain him some goodwill with the authorities.
Mr. Mills contacted his lawyer contacted the prosecutors.
Howell had boasted of 6 murders in addition to Nilsa's death. The problem for the police was that they only had 3 bodies. All of them had been identified, and none of them were Nilsa. Incredibly, Jonathan Mills had the information the police needed.
He showed him this map of what he believed where Howell's garden was. Howell had described like there were electrical wires and telephone poles and certain things in the air where he had buried them.
Between April and May in 2015, 12 years after the killings, they returned to the swamp.
With the assistance of this amazing cadaver dog, within days we had found the burial sites of all of our victims.
They found an additional 4 different human remains.
Once again, the state forensics lab played a crucial role.
So they submitted a sampling from each of the 4 different bodies in order to try and determine who they were by doing DNA testing on those bones. DNA profiles were developed.
They tracked down family members, got their DNAs, and then compared those DNAs to the bones that were recovered, and then were able to identify the individuals.
By June 2015, the bodies had been identified as Janice Roberts, Melanie Ruth Camellini, Marilyn Gonzalez, and the one victim Howell had been convicted of killing, Nilsa Arismendi. After more than a decade, the families of the women were learning of their fate.
They were waiting for answers, praying that these were not the answers they were going to get. We couldn't change what was done, but we could change the way their loved ones were treated from then on out, and that justice was brought for them.
But to get justice, detectives needed to build a case against William Devin Howell, the only suspect in the 6 murders. They believed the key to the case was Howell's battered blue work van.
So we got a search warrant, got the van that was held in storage by the Wethersfield Police Department. So it was still just sitting there like as if in a time capsule. We brought in the state police evidence technicians because their skill level is just tremendous. And they just started to pick that van apart, fiber by fiber, droplet by droplet.
They submitted a whole bunch more evidence from the van that consisted of cigarette butts, hairs, hairbrush.
There was a rock that appeared to have blood on it, as well as 6 graphic homemade videotapes.
There was over 200 pieces of evidence submitted from the van at this point.
The results of the DNA analysis were damning. Blood, hair, and other traces were found in the back of the van that match with 6 of the 7 victims.
In September 2015, Howell is charged with the 6 murders.
For the next 2 years, the police and prosecution prepared their case against Howell.
We wanted to convict. We wanted absolutely whoever was responsible for what happened to these ladies to be brought to justice. We wanted to make sure every T was crossed, every I was dotted, so it was meticulous work.
William Petzold was appointed as Howell's defense attorney, faced with the mammoth task of defending Howell against the prosecution's claims.
So they put the case together, and it was a mountain of evidence. It was, in my opinion, an insurmountable mountain to overcome.
Presented with the evidence against him, Howell and his attorney came to a decision.
He ultimately pled guilty and was sentenced to 360 years. Families were emotional. Certainly some belief that justice is being served, but anger too, sadness. No matter what, none of what the court system was going to do was going to bring their loved ones back.
"47-year-old Howell's statement at the sentencing hearing at New Britain's Superior Court was the first time any of the families had heard him speak.
He started to cry and he said, I'm going to stay in prison. I'm not a well man. I'm going to die a slow, painful death. In no way was he actually trying to give any comfort to the victims' families.
He was thinking of himself. You know, we were sitting with the families. Maybe some thought should have been for them. That's not where he went.
In fact, one of Howell's comments to his cellmate had betrayed his true feelings about the 7 victims.
Howell said that his victims should have known that they were going to die, just because of the kind of lives that they led.
He didn't think of these beautiful people as people. This is my take on it.
In a 10-month killing spree across 2003, Howell abducted, brutalized, and killed 7 women in the van he callously called his murder mobile, before dumping their bodies where he hoped they'd never be found. His victims' loved ones waited 14 years for justice, but when it finally came, they were left with no doubt that William Devin Howell is one of the world's most evil killers. In the early 1980s, young women in and around the state of Connecticut were disappearing without a trace. Their families were left in the dark about their loved ones' final moments.
I assumed it was probably related to drugs or something like that. I was not prepared for a serial killer.
After several missing persons were reported, police finally had a lead. Witness descriptions of a man in a car stalking a woman sparked a statewide manhunt.
The detectives start with one case, and then they find another case, and they begin to join the dots.
Police found a car matching that description, belonging to a man named Michael Ross.
The way he appeared, he was tall, very thin. You wouldn't think Michael was capable of this.
Because he was just like the guy next door. Like, he didn't give off that vibe where you would be tentative about maybe getting into a car, befriending him.
Despite his unassuming demeanor, Michael Ross was revealed to be one of Connecticut's most prolific offenders, as gruesome details about his sexual sadism unfolded.
Each time he would continue to rationalize again, and then as the cravings return, his willpower diminishes and the pattern repeats.
Michael Ross had been exposed as one of the world's most evil killers. In June 1984, Connecticut State Police were able to track down 24-year-old Michael Ross, the man responsible for the murder of teenager Wendy Baribeau. However, they would be shocked to discover that she was not his only kill.
He led the police to believe that he was probably the person they were looking for, even before they had a sense that that was the case.
Throughout his crime spree, you could see where there was that escalation, right? He started raping women, and then it did turn into killing them.
Ross was sentenced to death in April 2000, the first man in Connecticut in over 40 years to be given such a punishment. The decision to execute the serial killer sparked controversy, but his victims' families were just relieved to see justice served.
Supporters on one side of the road, the others, they're driving down, it's wrong to kill people, he deserves it. There was just so much give and take on it.
I don't care what they would have done to him. Either execute him or let him live the rest of his life in prison.
Regardless of his fate, Michael Ross's senseless killings would haunt his victims' loved ones forever.
If he would have adjusted his radio and drove by her, she'd be alive. If she turned around because she forgot her purse at her boyfriend's house, she'd still be alive. That is what haunted me from the time I found out it was opportunistic killing.
This killer's story begins on the 26th of July, 1959, in the small town of Brooklyn, Connecticut. Much of what we know about Ross's childhood came from his own accounts. Michael Bruce Ross was the eldest of 4 children and didn't have the smoothest of upbringings.
Ross was brought up on a chicken farm.
He grew up in a home that, whether he realized it or not, the parents weren't getting along.
Ross was raised in a relatively troubled family. His mother had some psychiatric issues, and she left the family to go and be with an old flame. And as a result, his father would find her, bring her back, and psychiatrically hospitalize her.
Even when his mother returned from hospital, the family dynamic failed to improve.
There were concerns that his mother and his father were in some ways, whether intentional or not, emotionally abusive.
She wasn't very affectionate. She didn't really bond very well with Ross.
Mother's in and out of institutions, and I think he was beaten by his parents.
At the age of 8, Ross was made to work on the chicken farm. One of his jobs was to wring the necks of ill and deformed chicks.
There's strong evidence that this environment was impacting on Ross because he started to have some of the signs very young that we would associate with somebody whose mental health is getting problematic.
It sounded like an absolute horrible upbringing. I think his family was so broken.
So it's hardly surprising by the time he gets to the age of 12, he becomes violent himself.
As Ross reached puberty, his behavior took a dark and sinister turn.
Ross started to struggle with sexual deviance at a very early age.
He's caught molesting a young girl. His father responds really badly to this and beats him and then takes him to the doctor, kind of saying there's something wrong with you. The doctor thinks there's something wrong, but he also says, well, this is nothing to worry about, really. He's starting to go through puberty.
Some of that behavior was frowned upon and looked at as deviant by his mother. So his mother would not approve of this behavior, and she would shame him and humiliate him.
I think simply punishing him in a very stern physical fashion was not going to be helpful. That kind of punishment isn't going to erase any kind of unusual sexual urges he's having. And then when seen by a professional to simply say, in effect, there's nothing to worry about, I think also was not the proper way to address this.
Despite this worrying behavior, Ross was able to progress into a model student and graduated high school in 1977. He then set his sights on New York and got accepted into Cornell University to study agricultural science and economics.
If you have that kind of opportunity to go to an Ivy League school and you're that bright, some things that I read that his IQ was like 155 or something. So that's extraordinarily high. Just because he's smart and he can go to college didn't take away, I don't think, the underlying sociopathic behavior that he had displayed throughout his upbringing.
Ross had several relationships with women whilst at university, and although he started off as the perfect student, his grades began to slip as his sexual impulses emerged once again.
It appears that he had a very strong sex drive, one to masturbate frequently with girlfriends, one to have sex maybe twice a day, and so on. Some of his girlfriends felt that he wanted sex more than they would have liked, not only because of the unusual and qualitatively different nature of his sexual makeup, but also because in addition to that, he had a very high sexual drive.
21-year-old Ross graduated from Cornell in 1981 and immediately found work in his preferred profession.
He graduated and got a job in Lewisburg. He's still trying to fit into the family business of egg manufacturing.
Ross asked his college girlfriend to leave Cornell and move out to North Carolina. However, she wasn't prepared to make the move.
In one case, when they had an argument, she had pushed him and he slapped her. At that point, she said, if you ever do that again, it's over.
In August 1981, his girlfriend says it's all over. That's enough. Ross, probably upset at the destruction of what he hoped might have been some kind of perfect relationship.
Michael Ross's life was spiraling out of control. After the breakup of his own relationship, his parents were soon divorced. Ross's reaction was to lash out.
On September 28th of 1981, Ross went on a road trip to Illinois and he abducted a woman. This is where we start to see Ross really display his hatred and his misogyny towards women. Something had gone wrong in his life, and he decided to take his rage out on a complete stranger.
He not only attacked her, grabbed her, he changed location. He dragged her into a wood.
A neighbor heard the young woman screaming and called the police.
As Ross fled the scene and the police escorted the 16-year-old back home, she spotted his vehicle that was parked on the same street.
She recognizes the vehicle, she recognizes Ross, and he's rapidly arrested. What he was effectively charged with was unlawful restraint, and he's only fined $500.
He's treated incredibly leniently. He is treated as if, boys will be boys. And that lenient sentence would have given him the message that he can get away with this. And at some level, he's not abnormal.
Despite the lesser punishment from the authorities, Ross was fired from his job. Nearly 5 months later, he found work at an egg farm in Croton, Ohio. But this fresh start was soon tainted once again.
Ross spotted another young woman. He stalked her, followed her home, knocked on her door, and beat her repeatedly.
Something must have spooked Ross in the middle of this horrible assault because he ran off and the woman was able to call the police. The police then located witnesses that had seen a man fitting Ross's description and were able to trace him back to his vehicle.
Ross denied the attack, but of course, he couldn't in the long run. She'd identified him. He stands trial and is indeed given 6 months in jail and a $1,000 fine for the attack.
Ross has what we call maladaptive coping skills, and he takes them to the next level. He's incapable of sitting with his distressing emotions, and so for him, it's logical to go ahead and commit crimes in order to make himself feel better, in order to make that pain and that distress go away.
Ross's life was starting to fall apart as his sexually motivated attacks on young women were seemingly escalating with no signs of slowing down. Over in Connecticut, police also had a lot on their plate when they received a call about a horrifying discovery. In June 1982, near Danielson, Connecticut, 23-year-old Deborah Smith Taylor was driving home with her husband when their car ran out of gas.
A state trooper drove the couple to a gas station in Danielson. While they were there, they got into an argument and Deborah decided she was going to make her own way home.
The trooper saw Deborah walk across to a bandstand and accept a ride from a young man, but she'd never make it home.
Her husband reported her missing, but the police had no leads on the case.
Over 4 months later, on the 30th of October 1982, Deborah's body was discovered in a wooded area near Brooklyn, Connecticut. an area located close to a family-run chicken farm.
The body is found in a site quite close to where the Ross family used to dump chicken waste, chicken excrement.
Police made their way to the Ross family farm and interviewed Michael Ross's father and brother. They also interviewed other employees on the farm, but no one there knew of Deborah or knew what could have happened to her.
And at that point, Michael Ross is still in jail for the attack in Ohio.
Despite a promising lead, the case soon went cold. It joined a pile of other cold cases, one of which had begun nearly 10 months earlier in the same county.
In January of 1982, a 17-year-old girl by the name of Tammy Williams was leaving her friend's apartment to make the 3-mile walk home. When she never arrived home, her father reported her missing.
Over 140 miles west of where Tammy Williams was last seen, a young high school student in Montgomery, New York, had also seemingly vanished in March 1982.
A girl called Paula Pereira, who was age 16, left school early because she said she wasn't feeling well. She wanted to go see her new boyfriend. Paula's mother reported her missing to the police. Her body wasn't found for a very long time.
Meanwhile, after a reduced 4-month stint in prison for assaulting a woman, 23-year-old Michael Ross's life appeared to be returning to normality. By May of 1983, he'd got a job at an insurance company in Norwich, Connecticut.
Ross's relationship, which had been on and off with a girl throughout this period, one part of him was trying to create a natural life, normal life, and the other part of him knew that he wasn't. He wasn't in any way normal.
He rented an apartment in Jewett City, and he managed to have a girlfriend, but that relationship began to sour pretty quickly.
In November 1983, a young woman who also worked in the Norwich area had left her boyfriend's house to return home. 19-year-old Robin Stavinsky's family were eagerly waiting to hear if she'd be coming to the family home for Thanksgiving.
Robin was my middle sister's stepdaughter. Her and her half-sister moved in when I was in the 2nd or 3rd grade. We grew up in the same neighborhood. We would bike ride, we'd go down to the lake, we'd go out in the boats. There was a constant flow of kids back and forth. Robin functioned more like an older sister. She was 18 months older than me. She would look like just about any college athlete. She was naturally strong, as many of the boys in the neighborhood that tried to cross her found out.
After she left school, Robin had moved in with her boyfriend, but would still come back to visit the family regularly.
I was coming home that Tuesday or Wednesday morning right before Thanksgiving. And my last comment was, everybody coming home for Thanksgiving, you know, have you talked to Robin? Is everybody coming back? And the last thing my sister said to me about that was that she hadn't heard from Robin and the plans weren't set. My sister was concerned that she hadn't responded and that maybe she was in trouble. There was definitely some concern from not hearing from her. It was probably about a week. They lost communication with her. Somebody reported her missing. It could have been my sister or her boyfriend.
On the 23rd of November 1983, 7 days after Robin was reported missing, the Stavinsky family finally got the news that they'd been dreading.
The police called my sister and said, "We think we found Robin."
Robin's body is discovered by a jogger, and she's partially clothed.
They found her in the wooded area. She had been raped and murdered, and they have no clue as to who or why or anything like that. I'm 18 years old. I remember not being able to process it, and I just remember sitting in disbelief for 5 or 10 minutes.
after the Stavinsky family identified Robin's body, detectives were keen to find out who had done this to her.
The first thing they did in this situation was they investigated and talked to her boyfriend, and clearly he didn't do it, right? And so they found that. So, I mean, this thing went cold as ice, like quick. They were working behind the scenes and following up on things, but there was no leads. I mean, there was nothing. There was no media about it. There was no newspaper articles about it. The thing that was the hardest early on was how somebody that was part of your family and you cared about so much could be just kind of wiped off the earth with not a speck of evidence or any kind of suspect.
5 months after the murder of Robin Stavinsky on the 22nd of April 1984, 2 schoolgirls from Griswold, Connecticut were planning a trip to Jewett City. 14-year-olds April Brunet and Leslie Shelley.
Leslie was born December 1st. She was an ordinary teenager. Liked music, was just getting into boys. She was fairly good in school. April was in her first year of high, and Leslie was in her 8th grade. And they used to catch the bus together, and from there, it just became a friendship. Either April was down our house or Leslie was up April's house.
The pair had even pretended to adopt each other as sisters, using fake adoption papers. It wasn't uncommon for children at that time to be out on their own.
It was safe. Even Jewett City you would think was safe. There was very little crime. There was a lot of kids around. I had gone to work. And as I was driving up the hill, April was coming down to our house. April said that her mother was going to bring them down and pick them up. My husband at the time didn't realize that April's mother had a 3 or 4 month old baby and a 4-year-old son at home. So there was no way she was going to pick them up.
The girls had actually walked the 3-mile journey to Jewett City by themselves, despite what they'd told both of their parents.
When I got home, I went into Leslie's room, and of course she wasn't there. Les never had done anything like that before. Usually when they said they were going to go somewhere and come home at, say, 9 o'clock, they were home at 9 o'clock.
That same evening, both of the girls' parents called the police to report their disappearances. But the police had no leads.
I couldn't imagine what was going on. Every rumor that April's mother and I decided to follow, it proved untrue. We also had a poster around Jewett City that my husband had made up of April and Leslie's picture on it and a reward.
Just like in the case of Robin Stavinsky, the families were left in the dark about what could have happened to Leslie and April. Had the 2 14-year-olds simply run away from home, or was something more sinister going on? It would take 2 months for the shocking truth to finally be revealed, in which time even more teens across Connecticut would vanish into thin air. On the 13th of June 1984, less than 2 months after the disappearances of Leslie Shelley and April Brunet, another young woman in the Jewett City area was reported missing.
A 17-year-old girl named Wendy Baribeau left a note indicating that she was going to walk down to the local grocery store. She was last seen around 4:30 in the afternoon walking on Route 12. When she didn't return home, her mother went out looking for her, and at 10:30 in the evening, she reported her missing to the police.
In the meantime, detectives were beginning to look for comparisons in previous missing persons cases across Connecticut, namely Tammy Williams and Deborah Smith Taylor.
These two girls had a lot of similarities. They had a similar build, they both had dark hair, and they were both last seen in Danielson, Connecticut.
There are no obvious fingerprints on the victims. We haven't got some of the tools that we have now. We are talking about 1984, a very long time before CSI or the Behavioral Science Unit or any indeed of the great innovations in tracing serial killers had happened.
That detective was then assigned to the Wendy Baribeau case before he had a chance to look further into it.
After a 2-day search to find Wendy Baribeau, a fireman discovered her body just a quarter of a mile away from her home in Lisbon, Connecticut. Detectives finally had a lead about what may have happened to the 17-year-old.
A witness claimed that he had seen a car parked on the side of the road and a man following Wendy Baribeau. He heard shouting between the two of them and thought nothing of it, assuming that they were just a couple arguing. But the next day, when he saw Wendy Baribeau on the news, he went to the police to give a description of the man and the car he had seen.
They try and track down cars that look alike, and they come up with a list of cars, and they work methodically down it.
After 13 days of gathering witness descriptions, detectives had a profile for the potential killer.
The police are looking for an attacker who is probably white Caucasian.
A 6-foot-tall male with a medium build, clean-shaven and with dark hair.
Probably in his late 20s or early 30s, and drives a particular kind of car.
The detective asked the vehicle licensing department for a list of similar vehicles and their owners that live locally to Wendy in the town of Griswold. On that list was Michael Ross.
The police turn up at the door of Michael Ross. When the first police officer goes to discuss the case with him, Ross is patently not a suspect.
Ross's car didn't entirely match the description given by witnesses, and the composite drawings didn't include glasses, which Ross was wearing. Police were almost convinced this was not their man.
Ross is not a suspect until Ross says to the detective, well, what if the man who was committing these crimes was to say he was insane? Does that mean he would escape the death penalty? And at that point, the detective realizes that Michael Ross is a great deal different from the way he may appear.
When originally interviewed by one of the police officers, he volunteered the fact that he'd had some other charges against him in the past, something at that point they had not yet known about. The police officer had the sense that maybe Mr. Ross was wanting to give him those clues.
Conveniently, Ross was able to give very detailed accounts of his movements on the day that Wendy Baribeau went missing, but couldn't remember what he did before or after that date.
This would have set alarm bells ringing for detectives, and they asked him to go with them to the police headquarters.
When the officer said that for the sake of the victims, if he'd done this, it would be important that he acknowledge it. And at that point, he didn't ask for an attorney. He simply waived his rights and confessed.
The detectives couldn't believe their luck. They had little evidence to suggest that unassuming 24-year-old Michael Ross was behind Wendy's murder.
Here's a man who was confessing to very serious crimes under circumstances where it wasn't clear at that point that there was even much evidence against him that would be incriminating.
Ross seemed to revel in reliving the crimes that he had committed. He also had quite a narcissistic disposition and a large ego, which I suspect was one of the reasons that he was so willing to confess and willing to talk to the police officers about what he had done.
There's a couple of reasons why this might happen. Now, with some serial killers, they're bragging. They just want to say, yeah, this is what I've done. I'm actually quite proud of it. For others, and Ross might fall more into this category, they're almost relieved that they've been caught because the compulsions and the killing is not necessarily easy for them to live with.
Incredibly, Michael Ross was only just getting started. Not only did the 24-year-old admit to the murder of Wendy Baribeau, but he also confessed to killing Tammy Williams, Deborah Smith Taylor, Robin Stavinsky, and the murder of 14-year-old friends April Brunet and Leslie Shelley.
Leslie and April, they encounter a man who offers them a lift to get home quickly.
Ross had offered to drive April and Leslie to a gas station, but he passed the gas station and kept on driving.
The first thing he does is he takes Leslie, ties her up and puts her in the trunk of the car. Then he attacks April and forces her into the well of the passenger seat of the car.
After killing April, he took Leslie out of the trunk and strangled her. He put her body back in the trunk and began driving around looking for a place to dispose of their lifeless bodies.
Ross takes them back to Connecticut and dumps them in a culvert.
Ross told detectives where they could find the bodies of the two teens. Investigators then had to break the tragic news to April and Leslie's families.
I was at work and my supervisor came up to the floor and told me that there was a detective downstairs that wanted to talk to me. And that's when I found out about Leslie. It was horrible. It was just terrible. And then I had got home. My husband got home a few minutes later. And then a different detective came down to question us. It was a nightmare. We were so busy with detectives that you didn't really have time to think. You really didn't. I couldn't believe it at first, that somebody in this quiet town could do something like that.
It wasn't just the Shelley and Brunet families that received the devastating news. Robin Stavinsky's loved ones finally found out what had happened to the 19-year-old athlete.
They have a guy. They think he killed other women. Robin's not the only one, and it's going to be on the news tonight. We were elated. They found him. But the elation was short-lived because it was random. If he would have adjusted his radio and drove by her, she'd be alive. If she turned around because she forgot her purse at her boyfriend's house, she'd still be alive. That is what haunted me from the time I found out it was opportunistic killing. There was no reason behind it.
Michael Ross went into detail about how he spotted Robin walking home alone that evening and offered her a lift.
Ross attacks her and she passes out. But she comes round and she begins to fight.
Ross tried to strangle her, but Robin was a strong woman. She was an athlete at school and she put up a fight. Unfortunately, Ross eventually overpowered her.
She's dumped, as though she was no more than a piece of garbage.
On the 29th of June 1984, Ross was taken to Norwich Superior Court by police after being charged with Wendy Baribeau's murder and confessing to Robin's. Family members of the victims were at the hearing.
As they marched him in, he was thin and had the glasses on, and we were just like, you've got to be fucking kidding me. He killed Robin. Like, we were, I think most of us were in disbelief that Robin didn't kick the shit out of him, to be honest with you. She was a tough girl. He must have either got her down or surprised her, because he did not look like a strong guy to me.
After his shocking confessions, detectives were able to charge Ross with not one, but 6 murders. But there was no time for jubilation. The prosecution had to prepare for one of the biggest murder trials in Connecticut's history. Michael Ross would have to face 2 separate court cases across 2 jurisdictions in Connecticut. The 26-year-old had a plan to avoid the death penalty.
In November 1985, to the murders of Tammy and Deborah in Windham County in Connecticut, Ross pleads no contest and receives a sentence of 120 years.
18 months after his conviction, Ross was back in court charged with 4 murders in the county of New London. For fairness, due to the amount of pre-trial publicity, the case was moved to Bridgeport County, and this time it was the killer's life that was on the line.
In May 1987, Michael Ross stands trial for the murders of Wendy, Robin, and the 2 14-year-olds, Leslie and April.
Ross tried a different ploy for avoiding the death penalty. His defense asked for a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity, but the tactic ultimately failed. On the 5th of June 1987, it took the jury just 86 minutes to convict Michael Ross on all counts.
Ross, of course, is serving the 120 years he's already been given. He's now confronting the death penalty.
Connecticut law stated that if a defendant was found guilty of a capital felony, the jury must then decide whether to impose the death penalty. But there was a catch.
If an individual had a psychiatric disorder, that was by statute in Connecticut supposed to mitigate against him getting the death penalty.
The defense team had to rely on the testimonies of behavioral scientists to determine if Michael Ross had a mental disorder. One of those experts was Dr. Fred Berlin, who'd met and analyzed Ross on several occasions.
I had an interview with him in the prison where he'd been incarcerated at that time. My first impression was that if I didn't know about the nature of the crimes that he's committed, there was nothing in seeing him or in interacting with him that would have suggested to me that he was a particularly dangerous individual.
Despite his meek appearance, Ross didn't hold back on the details of his brutal and sadistic crimes.
It was also very clear in looking at that we're likely talking about a serial killer who was acting in ways that included sexual involvements with his victims. And that individual has recurrent, intense cravings in which he is turned on sexually by the suffering, the degradation, the pain, even the death of another human being. I didn't have any doubt that he had the diagnosis of sexual sadism.
The prosecution argued that Ross was a calculating killer who raped and strangled his victims for sexual pleasure.
A lot of the times people have this misconception that strangulation is quick and easy. It's not. Strangulation takes a lot of rage, it takes a lot of force, it takes a lot of personal up-close contact with the victim. And so Ross really was the epitome of a psychopathic serial killer. And had he not been stopped, he would have kept on going. He admitted that himself.
For the families of the victims, seeing their loved one's killer in the flesh brought up a mixture of emotions. Leslie Shelley's father was one of those in attendance.
There was anger, there was sadness, there was all of that. I just remember Mr. Shelley painfully raging. As much pain as we were in, I don't think I've ever seen another man in as much pain. That stood out to me.
On the 6th of July, 1987, the jury found Michael Ross to be deserving of the death penalty. But Ross's defense team appealed to the Supreme Court. And 7 years later, they ruled that a critical error made by the prosecution should overturn his sentence, reducing it to life in prison.
The prosecution was subsequently chastised because they'd held back the fact from the jury initially that even the government's evaluator agreed that he had this kind of mental disorder. And so that's one of the reasons they had to have a second sentencing. Yes, he was having these cravings in the same way a drug addict might have cravings, but could he have been able to control it?
The second sentencing took place in April 2000. After 5 weeks of testimonies and 9 days of deliberations, the jury finally reached their verdict.
The jury decided that they felt he could have controlled it, that he was criminally responsible.
What happens is that jury confirms the death penalty that's been given in Bridgeport County. Ross finds himself on death row.
Robin Stavinsky's uncle Morgan Hills couldn't attend the trial, but was eagerly awaiting the result at home.
I don't think it was relief. I never recall anybody saying that when this guy dies or is executed or convicted, we can kind of start to get back to normal. There was no normal. Normal was being redefined every day from November 23rd on for everybody.
Whilst in prison, Ross revealed in several interviews with a psychologist that his murderous rampage had actually started a lot earlier than originally thought, back in May 1981, during his time at Cornell University.
A Vietnamese-born young woman called Zung Tu. She's 25. She's clever. She's absolutely marvelous, vivacious young woman.
Zun was last seen leaving the campus library, and her body was found in a stream next to a house that Ross was living in. But there wasn't enough evidence to indict him.
In October 2001, Ross pled guilty to the March 1982 murder of Paula Pereira and was sentenced to another 8 to 25 years in prison. Although he confessed to killing Zung Nok Tu during his time at Cornell University, he was never prosecuted for her death. Prison warden Anne Konoya worked as Ross's counselor during his time at the Department of Correction in Connecticut.
My first impression was that he was really arrogant. I don't ever think that Michael Ross felt that he was like the other people on death row. I think he always felt that he was above them. He talked to me a little bit about remorse and hurting families, and I never got that to be a genuine statement from him. I felt like he was trying to manipulate me.
Contrary to his previous appeals, Ross himself expressed his acceptance of the death penalty to the people evaluating him behind bars.
Mr. Ross said that he did not want the families of the victims to go through that and decided not to appeal the death penalty.
His attorneys wanted to say that he wasn't fit to make those decisions, and I don't agree.
On the 13th of May 2005, Michael Ross was executed by lethal injection at the age of 45. He was the last person in Connecticut to receive such a penalty after capital punishment was repealed in 2012.
Michael kept his glasses on and his eyes closed. He never turned to look at any of us. That was the end of it.
After Ross's execution, the Shelley family suffered further heartbreak. For Leslie's father, the loss of his beloved daughter was too great to bear.
It changed my husband. He never really got over it. It was like he was isolating him and myself from his children, his grandchildren, his great-grandchildren. And then in 2010, he committed suicide. He never got over Leslie, and he always blamed himself. He changed so much.
Over the course of 2 years, Ross had murdered at least 7 innocent women and girls. Even when he was behind bars, he claimed that his deviant urges couldn't be contained.
He went on medication because he was afraid that even in prison, he would attack some of the female guards that were in there because of the cravings he was experiencing.
He said that he would likely do the same to me if he had the opportunity. The fact that he thought about it, it was a little unsettling for me.
The execution of Michael Ross had left families with mixed emotions.
There was even victims' families that didn't advocate for the death penalty. But for those who did, that I think it did probably bring some sort of closure to their nightmare that they have to live.
As far as trying to understand Michael, to this day, I don't hate him, but I don't like him neither for taking my daughter away. It's hard.
Robin's loss left a gaping hole in a lot of people, just as you would imagine. You know, she had quite a large family that cared about her, and the loss was felt for many generations. I think he's your classic sexual predator and psychopath. And their body's telling him they have to kill. He has to kill, and Robin walked into his crosshairs.
Ross was a savage and dangerous predator who would stop at nothing to fulfill his twisted carnal urges. He attacked numerous innocent young women and girls, over half of whom would never see the light of day again. The 45-year-old's 2005 execution put an end to a life of sexual deviancy and undoubtedly makes Michael Ross one of the world's most evil killers. In September 1989, two brothers, 10-year-old Billy and 11-year-old Cole Neer, went missing while playing in David Douglas Park in Washington State.
With these little boys, these crimes are so horrible. I just shudder to even think about it.
The following month, in the neighboring state of Oregon, 4-year-old Lee Isley was abducted from his local play area. His body was discovered almost 4 weeks later.
And I knew at that moment, I go, my God, what am I gonna do? I'm afraid every minute of the day, another dead kid.
The killer was 28-year-old Wesley Allen Dodd. The unassuming shipping clerk had been abusing children for over 10 years and was ready to tell all to investigators.
You have the right to remain silent. You understand that? Yes.
And he actually built a torture rack tied with ropes that were all ready to tie the next victim down and basically torture them.
I gotta rub this back. I wish I didn't have to do this. Well, he wasn't a nice kid.
Wesley Allen Dodd had confessed to being one of the world's most evil killers. The crimes of Wesley Allen Dodd shocked even the most seasoned of detectives. When the 28-year-old confessed to 3 sickening murders, it was hard for psychoanalyst Dr. Ronald Turco to imagine Dodd was capable of such depravity.
If you met this person at the gym or in the street and spoke with him, you would have no idea that he was dangerous in any way or in any way had a sexual deviation, let alone be a killer.
Homicide detective C.W. Jensen, who investigated Dodd, had a similar opinion of him.
He was a nobody, and Wesley Allen Dodd would have passed through this world with no one ever noticing him, except for that he was an evil deviant.
Dodd's stunning confessions were confirmed by a horrific diary which he kept under lock and key.
Wesley Allen Dodd doesn't have the body count of, say, Stalin, but in his heart, he was just as bad.
This killer's story begins in the Pacific Northwest.
Wesley Dodd was born on the 3rd of July, 1961, in a place called Toppenish in Washington State.
He was kind of a geek. He wasn't real popular, but there was nothing out of the ordinary in his life.
He had a brother and a sister, and they were the favorite in the family. He was not close to his siblings.
The family moved around a lot during Dodd's childhood.
His father had a series of jobs. He'd had some health issues. His mother was going out to work. There was a lot of arguing in the family.
Dodd's home life was seemingly chaotic. In 1970, when he was 9, he had an uncomfortable moment in front of his aunts.
And he had to change his clothes in front of them and was seen in his underwear. He had never forgotten this. It was a trauma for him. He was very much embarrassed.
With a transient family life, Dodd never seemed to settle down. He was often moving schools and struggled to fit in wherever he went.
He wasn't a particularly happy child. He was a loner.
And he played in the high school band. But he did well with the clarinet. With regard to relationships to other people and band members, very little emotional interaction.
He struggled with his sexuality.
Dodd recognized from a young age that he was attracted to boys, small boys.
If you're that way at 11, you're going to be that way at 31.
As he hit adolescence, Dodd began to explore his unnatural fantasies. In May 1975, aged just 13, he began flashing at younger children in the neighborhood.
He does it from his bedroom window, and the kids go home and go, Wesley's exposing himself to us as we walk by his house.
If you are exposing yourself, what you are actually enjoying is the look of shock and fear on the victims' faces. Why would somebody be enjoying that? That should be problematic to us, that this is how they get their kicks, if you like.
Parents of the children reported this activity to the police, who then paid a visit to the Dodd house in July 1975. They spoke to Dodd's father, but ultimately no further action was taken.
The authorities looked upon this as less than relevant. He used that because he knew they're not going to do anything. And that was the first step in what became a progression of sexual activity with children.
He was a genuinely malevolent force because he focused his interests on tiny, completely innocent children.
Nobody's really stopping him. Nobody's giving him a strong message that this is absolutely unacceptable. He's almost trained himself that this is the way to behave, and he's starting to really enjoy it.
During his formative years, Dodd was often in trouble with the police for indecent exposure. As he matured into adulthood, his deviant urges showed no signs of slowing down. In September 1981, Dodd enlisted in the Navy, but continued to offend whenever he found an opportunity.
He continues to sexually abuse young children. And he doesn't even seem to be particularly concerned that anybody's going to hold him to account. But this time, he's a man, he's not a child himself.
Dodd was arrested in December 1982 for attempting indecent liberties on a boy, and this time was dishonorably discharged from the Navy.
He was ordered to counseling 3 or 4 different times, including the time he was discharged from the Navy. The counseling was never helpful.
In 1984, Dodd was arrested yet again for molesting a 10-year-old boy, but only received a 1-year suspended sentence. Later that year, he was convicted for molesting a 13-year-old boy. This time, the 23-year-old received a 10-year sentence, but he was soon a free man.
That sentence was reduced to just 4 months. And the reason given was that he made a very good account of himself in court. And that suggests, of course, that he is potentially a highly manipulative individual. That fits with most pedophiles. They do learn very, very quickly how to present themselves in a way that's going to get them exactly what they want.
It wasn't long before Dodd was once again in trouble with the authorities. In June 1987, the 25-year-old approached a young boy on the streets of Seattle.
Dodd attempted to abduct a boy and take him to a derelict building. The boy objected violently and ran off. But of course he could identify Dodd, and it didn't take very long indeed for the police to track Dodd down and arrest him for the charge.
Wesley Allen Dodd was back behind bars for now. When he sat down for an interview with detectives, the 25-year-old wasn't going to deny the allegations. In fact, Dodd's confession would chill investigators to the bone. In June 1987, Wesley Allen Dodd was arrested for trying to lure a child into an abandoned building. The case landed on the desk of Deputy Prosecuting Attorney Anne Bremner.
I first heard the name Wesley Allen Dodd when I was assigned his case for trial. I had a note from my supervisor, Becky Rowe, that said, and I can still remember it to this day, she wrote, "Anne, get this guy, he's scary."
Our team's goal in this case was to convict him of the highest charge possible and put him in prison for as long as we could, which at that time under the charge that we had would have been 5 years. That would have been the maximum. He was incredibly dangerous, probably the most dangerous I'd seen up to that time, and he needed to be locked up as long as we could lock him up.
But when Anne Bremner met Dodd for the first time, he didn't look like the dangerous predator she'd been warned about.
Wesley Dodd was a very kind of slight, non-imposing person. He could look to be non-threatening to a child, just in his stature and in his affects. He almost like kind of faded into the wall kind of person. He was timid, but creepy, at the same time.
The arrest report gave a shocking insight into Dodd's depravity.
This little boy was living with his mom in a motel on Aurora Avenue in Seattle. Some of the area was high for prostitution, drug dealing, things like that, but it was not a great place for a little boy to be. And so Wesley Dodd approached him.
This little boy, who I think was only 8 or 9, said no, went home, told his parents. They called the police.
The boy identified him on the street because he hung around.
It's kind of remarkable that this boy sensed that there was something wrong with this guy who had been befriending him.
It was Dodd's ensuing interview with detectives that stunned the two prosecutors the most.
He said I wanted to touch him sexually and have him touch me. Why did he just give this full confession? I've just never seen that in my sex cases. Somebody that just felt proud of what he was going to do.
Dodd's confession was remarkable. Usually we were left to try to make arguments based on a pattern of conduct that this is what this person is going to go and do in the future if you don't lock him up. But this guy's like telling you what he's going to do if he's not locked up.
The prosecutors filed for attempted kidnapping in the first degree, which was the highest possible charge they could impose on Dodd.
We alleged attempting kidnap, which was trying to lure him away for purposes of committing a crime, a sexual assault.
But the problem with the case is that the building where he wanted to go with the boy was not a place where he could hide the little boy. And so that was a problem because kidnapping requires that the child be taken to a place where they cannot be found. What the judge found was, regardless of his intentions and his confession, he still was going to take him in a place where the child could be found.
Because of the legal aspects, the judge was obligated to require evidence of Dodd's intention.
The judge said that Dodd needed to have said something to the little boy along the lines of intending to do something sexual before the confession could be admitted.
The verdict happened with the judge. Judge says this is not a felony, it's a gross misdemeanor.
The judge also ordered him into counseling, which at that point in time would have seemed, frankly, silly and futile to me, given what this guy said in his confession.
After his probation period came to an end, 27-year-old Wesley Dodd abandoned his counseling sessions and relocated to Vancouver, Washington, where he found work as a shipping clerk. Despite a long list of felonies, Dodd was a free man. On Labor Day 1989, at David Douglas Park in Vancouver, Washington, two brothers were enjoying a day off school.
On the 4th of September, two boys, Cole and Billy Neer, were playing in the park.
Away from their parents, 10-year-old Billy and 11-year-old Cole were lured to a secluded area by a stranger.
They were riding their bikes, and he asked them in an authoritative fashion to come with him into the woods. And then he brought them in and he asked them to drop their pants. They didn't want to do it. And the older boy was very concerned, very frightened. He eventually got his clothes off, but the children were resisting.
He tied him with shoestrings. The older brother could have run away, but he wouldn't leave his brother.
After assaulting both children, the attacker wasn't finished. He produced a knife and began to stab them repeatedly.
This is a horrific crime. It's a sexual attack on boys aged 10 and 11 in a public park in broad daylight when they're literally only a few hundred yards from their own home. It is the most disgraceful, depraved crime you can imagine.
Thinking that he'd killed both brothers, the assailant fled the scene. At 2 a.m. the following morning, 11-year-old Cole's body was discovered in the park. 10-year-old Billy was found soon after the attack, still fighting for his life.
He's rushed to hospital, but sadly dies on the way.
The offender wasn't identified. 2 children had been killed in broad daylight, and the attacker had got away, leaving no obvious clues.
They were just normal people out for a holiday, and these poor kids ran into the worst person at the worst time.
8 weeks later, on the 29th of October 1989, 15 miles from the murder of the Neer brothers, across the state border in Portland, Oregon, 4-year-old Lee Isley was playing with his older brother.
Lee is playing on a slide in the park. His brother is riding his bike.
Lee kind of wandered off on his own, and then he was gone.
When Lee's family discovered he was missing, police and the media immediately launched a search for the boy. Homicide detective C.W. Jensen was hoping it was a case he wouldn't have to work on.
I was eating breakfast, and I'm reading the newspaper about a missing 4-year-old boy. He had his picture in there, and I looked at my wife, and I said, "This is going to be horrible." I go, "This kid is dead." And she goes, "What do you mean?" I go, "He disappeared yesterday afternoon." I go, "It's either he's been kidnapped, killed, or he's fallen in something." I said, "I am so glad I'll have no part of this thing." And 2 hours later, it became the center of my world.
On the 1st of November, 3 days after his disappearance, the body of Lee Isley was discovered by a hunter near Vancouver Lake in Washington. He was just 4 years old. Detective Jensen was called to the crime scene.
By the time I got there, you know, the news crews were starting. We had them back pretty far, but news crews were getting there and a lot of people watching. And I can remember walking up to the body. It was the first time I looked at him and I realized he looks like my daughter. Exactly. You know, you got to figure it out. You got to make it happen. Got to work. Got to find out who did it. You know, more kids are going to die.
At the time of this particular case, I was a detective with the Newburgh Police Department, and I worked child kidnap, child molestation, other child murder, and so on. So when this case came up, I was asked by the Portland police to become involved, and I became a part of the multi-agency task force.
And I knew there was more dead kids coming. So I called him up and I go, "Hey, Ron, FBI can't help me. Can you help me?"
Dr. Ronald Turco put together a profile of who the likely offender would be.
Mid to late 20s, would have a strong history of sexual deviation, both exposure as well as actual contact with children, that he was very clever, that he was going to be very careful, and initially he was probably committing sexual crimes without violence, but obviously there was an escalation of violence which was going to continue.
With Lee's body now recovered, investigators could try and discover what had happened to him.
So when we looked at the autopsy pictures, we could see rope, the ligatures around the neck, and other parts of his body.
There was also clear evidence of sexual assault.
I went to the autopsy, and I mean, I've been to a bunch of autopsies. Lee's post-mortem examination was reverential. It was almost like a religious service. The silence. The doctor, he was so gentle. He was just so good to him, so gentle with him. His little hair. And I knew at that moment, I go, my God, what am I going to do? Just the gravity of everything.
It was critical Detective Jensen found the person responsible fast, but there wasn't enough evidence to progress the investigation, even with an eyewitness statement from Lee's older brother.
It wasn't real clear. You had this story from the brother about Lee being around a dude in the schoolyard. It's murky. This thing is exploding in the newspaper. Once it's in the paper or on the media, you get all these calls, and you got to do something with them.
It was only a matter of time before the insatiable murderer struck again.
He was never, ever going to stop. He had to be stopped.
He was going to kill the next child. There's no question about that. No question in his mind, no question in my mind.
When you don't know what to do, you do anything. And we didn't know what to do, and we were doing everything. I'm afraid every minute of the day for another dead kid.
Time was of the essence. Every second Lee's attacker was out there, no child was safe. But fortunately for detectives, the killer was about to make a big mistake. In November 1989, a child killer was on the loose in the Pacific Northwest. The investigation was ongoing, and many suspects were questioned. But 4-year-old Lee Isley's attacker still hadn't been identified.
They have what's called a cooling off period in between all of their murders. They get to this point where they've got to kill someone, they really want to do it. But after they've killed them, they get a sense of relief and they come back down.
Less than 2 weeks after Lee's murder, a woman, accompanied by her boyfriend, took her son to see a movie.
On the 13th of November 1989, a 6-year-old boy goes to the men's room in a theatre in Camas in Washington, about 12 miles east of Vancouver, and is abducted by a man who grabs him in the men's room and carries him through the movie theatre out into the foyer.
The child was very strong, started fighting with him. They picked the child up, he's, come on, let's go. I'm going to take you for a ride. And the child was screaming all the way out, but the boyfriend began to look for the child and put 2 and 2 together. The child wasn't in the bathroom. He heard a child being carried out, so he went out and looked around.
The abductor fled the theatre, but his car broke down before he could leave the area.
Well, the boyfriend walks up and says, can I help? You've got a problem with your car.
Realizing something was far from normal, the boyfriend put the would-be abductor in a headlock and held on until the police arrived.
I think I was watching football, having a beer at home, and my partner calls me, and he said, Camas PD just grabbed a guy, tried to grab a little boy in the movie theater. He goes, we should go talk to him.
Detective Jensen arrived at the police station, ready to interview the suspect. The man in front of him was identified as Wesley Allen Dodd.
Wesley Allen Dodd is a geek, so don't look for some horrible Marvel action villain to get your kid. Your kid is grabbed by a 5'7" geek, little pencil neck. That's your evil people. They're everywhere. Well, Wesley was happy to tell me about the minor, at least in the judicial system, minor things he did with kids. You know, at the very end, one of the last things he said was, I abused kids, I would never hurt a kid. You know, it's just pleasantries. And then what's the deal on the movie theater? And then we talked a little bit about, well, I mean, have you done this before?
Dodd began to confess to the murder of Lee Isley, going into horrific detail about the 4-year-old's final moments.
Where he proceeded to put the 4-year-old boy through the most horrifying ordeal imaginable. He stripped him of his clothes and he tied him to the bed. He then proceeded to assault him, sexually assault him, repeatedly, and took pictures of the boy and of his assaults as trophies of what he'd done.
The sickening ordeal continued into the following day.
Eventually, he decided if he was going to go to work, he couldn't have a witness.
In a display of grotesque depravity, Dodd strangled Lee Isley to death.
If a killer uses more violence than is necessary to kill someone, or if that killer prolongs the suffering of their victim, that means they are actually enjoying the process of hurting and killing them. So they are sadists. Sadists enjoy hurting.
He burnt the clothes and he put Lee's body in a black plastic garbage bag and dumped it near Vancouver Lake, just like the rubbish.
It was a horrendous admission, but Wesley Allen Dodd was only just getting going. Without prompt, he suddenly also confessed to raping and murdering Cole and Billy Neer on Labor Day in Vancouver, Washington.
I had just gotten to the point where I believed he killed Lee Isley. Now he's admitted to everybody. And I kind of glance at my partner like, I mean, I couldn't believe it because Vancouver police thought they had the suspect in the Neer brothers' killing.
Ronald Turco also had the opportunity to sit down and interview Dodd.
I showed him my badge. I said, you know, you're under arrest. I'm a homicide detective. I'm here to talk with you. And I read his rights.
You have the right to remain silent. You understand that? Yes.
He didn't seem like much, but he seemed like what I suspected would be the killer. It's sort of a nondescript, run-of-the-mill kind of guy. Nothing special. He spoke in a very bland way.
When did you make the conscious decision you're going to have to kill him?
So 3 o'clock in the morning, I figured probably around 5:30 or so I had to kill him.
Have you already decided how you were going to do it at that time?
Yeah, I decided that for that. I had to choke him. He was laying on top of me, and I was holding him. I got rubbed his back. I thought, I wish I didn't have to do this. It was my light skin.
Investigators knew a confession alone wouldn't guarantee a conviction. They needed hard evidence. They made the decision to get a warrant to search Dodd's apartment, which suddenly caused a shift in the 28-year-old's demeanor.
His head starts to go down. May have been a tear. And he goes, on my keychain, there's a key. It unlocks a briefcase under my bed. And in there, you'll find things about Lee and the other boys.
As officers entered Dodd's home, they had no idea what they might find. With key in hand, they slowly unlocked the briefcase under his bed, and the true extent of Wesley Allen Dodd's depravity was finally revealed. Hidden under lock and key at his home in Vancouver, Washington, detectives discovered that Wesley Allen Dodd had been keeping a diary documenting his life of sexual deviancy since his childhood.
When detectives went to search Dodd's apartment, they found, horrifyingly, Lee Isley's underpants, a whole series of pictures of Lee and other victims in an album marked Memories.
He had a whole series of photographs. That was part of his diary. He had them clipped in. And then in detail, he wrote about specifically how the murders occurred, what he did, and what he was going to do next.
These are his proudest moments. He achieved something. For Wesley Allen Dodd, his dream was killing little boys. His work that he was proud of, he wrote down. And it was all about abusing children. That was his goal. That was what he lived for. That is what he is proud of. That is what he memorialized in his pathetic little life.
Within those diaries were his plans for future attacks. This guy is incredibly determined and he's enjoying what he's doing. There's no remorse or shame or guilt. There's just, I need to repeat this because I enjoy this.
In August of 1989, he begins writing about a pact with the devil, and he actually asks Satan to help him. This is the kind of delusion that he has. It's not a psychotic delusion. He knows it's not real, but he's using everything that he can to commit murder or molestation.
The diary revealed how Dodd had tormented helpless 4-year-old Lee Isley.
With Lee, he would strangle him till he passed out. He would bring him back. I mean, he basically tortured this little kid for several hours.
Investigators searching Wesley Dodd's apartment discovered even more disturbing artifacts.
He actually built a torture rack we found in the apartment. He put together with wood boards tied with ropes that were all ready to tie the next victim down and basically torture them.
Dodd had taken photographs of his victims and he had taken trophies as well. He wanted to relive those moments and he was making sure that he could.
After the horrific discoveries at his home, Wesley Allen Dodd was charged with murder and attempted abduction.
I said, get someone to take him to jail. I don't want to look at him. I don't want to see him till I have to. And I said, I can't wait to take a shower. It's going to be a long one. I said, I've never felt more filthy in my life than I do right now, being with him.
Dodd's trial for the murders of Cole Neer, Billy Neer and Lee Isley, as well as the attempted murder of the 6-year-old boy he tried to abduct from the movie theater, began in May 1990 at the Clark County Superior Court. Despite his earlier confessions, Dodd pled not guilty to all the charges.
We were pretty well prepared. I mean, the defense did the best they could, but it was, a fait accompli that he was guilty.
He was, as usual, bland, not responsive, seemed to be interested in what was going on. About as interested as you might be in maybe watching a movie.
Even without his confessions, the evidence against Dodd was overwhelming, and in June 1990, he changed his plea to guilty. On July the 14th, a jury concluded that he should be sentenced to death. During his time on death row, Dodd astonishingly launched a safety campaign for children.
He went on this one-man redemption tour where it was like, I'm a really awful person So tell your kids not to talk to awful people like me. I don't need to hear that from you, Wes. Be careful with your kids around strangers. Buddy went on this media tour from jail, and of course the reporters were only too happy to do the story. And so he enjoyed that bit of notoriety.
Dodd even produced a leaflet to help parents keep their children away from predators like himself.
He writes a leaflet saying that he has this special insight in how to keep children safe. And he's almost saying that he's doing this as some kind of atonement. There's nothing in there that has the slightest bit of insight. It's all of the safety advice that we have been giving to children for years. But what he's actually done is he's kept up that communication with children even behind bars, because that's all he lives for. And that's the most outrageous, egregious thing I've ever seen, that he was able to get that out of the prison walls at all.
In January 1993, it was time for Dodd to pay the ultimate price for his crimes. Reporters gathered at Washington State Penitentiary to witness the execution. Dodd's father said, "Of course I still love Wes. He's my son. But my love for him doesn't alter the facts of what he's done. He's guilty of a horrible crime and should pay the penalty prescribed by law."
I probably could have gone to the execution. I don't know. I put him there. What's the point of seeing him there? I did my job. You guys do your job. But that being said, you show me a guy that kills little kids, kill him.
Just after midnight on the 5th of January 1993, 31-year-old Wesley Allen Dodd was executed by hanging.
Dodd was given the opportunity of choosing between a lethal injection or hanging. Dodd chose to be hanged because he'd hanged Lee Isley in his closet in his apartment. Very measured, very Dodd, all carefully calculated. Okay, well, if I'm going to die, I want to die in the way I choose.
So he's gone, but he went out his way.
Dodd's execution meant that parents across the Pacific Northwest could sleep a little easier. Had he been stopped sooner, 3 children would not have been taken so young.
I've never had a case that had the unique blend of somebody stating their intent to committing these crimes if they weren't locked up. You know, he had enough self-awareness of how evil he was. We did everything that we could have done to try to stop him within our law.
These crimes are so horrible with these little boys. I just shudder to even think about it. It's just the worst I've seen in my entire career. And I've, prosecuted murder cases, sexual assault cases, death cases. He was about as scary as they come.
Dodd was an absolutely unrepentant paedophile who, had he not been caught, almost by accident in that movie theater in Camas, would have gone on to rape and kill other boys.
The case was so disturbing for C.W. Jensen that the crimes of Wesley Allen Dodd remain a nightmare that will haunt him forever.
I left homicide a little over a year after Lee Isley case. I would think, please don't give me another kid. I'll take anything, no more kids. And I said, I'm done. When you talk about evil people, it's a gradient. It's subjective. But you got to be a sleazebag to kill little kids. It's not body count. It's just the evil and the malice that comes with it. He wasn't the scariest guy I ever met, but he was the worst guy I ever met.
Dodd was a twisted paedophile who could not control his unnatural urges. His crimes escalated from flashing to kidnap, and ultimately from torture to murder. His shocking confessions will live long in the memory of the detectives who interrogated him, while he spoke candidly about killing 3 innocent victims whose lives he took away before they'd had the chance to begin. Wesley Allen Dodd is undoubtedly one of the world's most evil killers.